When the Estrada family moved into Evergreen Hills, they were excited for a new beginning. But a cold welcome from their neighbors revealed a hidden prejudice. Refusing to be driven out, they chose courage and kindness, slowly unraveling the walls of bias around them. In an inspiring turn, their resilience reshaped the community, proving that true strength lies in unity and acceptance. The Estrada family was filled with excitement as they pulled into the picturesque community of Evergreen Hills. After years of hard work and countless sacrifices, Jaime Estrada, a former military officer turned high school counselor, and his wife, Sofia, a dedicated nurse known for her warmth, finally found a home where they could settle with their children, Ana and Mateo. For the Estradas, Evergreen Hills represented the dream they'd fought so long to achieve. A neighborhood known for its excellent schools, safe streets, and close-knit community spirit. The Estrada's car rolled to a stop in front of their new house, a two-story structure with an expansive porch, a lush front lawn, and, to their delight, a swing hanging from the large oak tree in the front yard. As they stepped out of the car, Jaime wrapped an arm around Sofia, both of them taking in the sight with a sense of awe. "This is it," Sofia whispered, her eyes misting with joy as she glanced at her husband. "We're finally home." Ana, their 14-year-old daughter, was already bouncing with excitement, her bright smile lighting up as she twirled on the porch. Meanwhile, 10-year-old Mateo ran straight for the swing, eager to test its strength with a gleeful laugh. Their voices echoed through the quiet street, bringing a fresh sense of life to the house. However, as the Estradas began unloading their boxes, they felt a subtle but unmistakable sense of observation. Across the street, in a large, pristine house framed by towering hedges, an older woman watched them through her window, her gaze intense and unreadable. Eleanor Gardner, known as Mrs. Gardner to the neighborhood, had lived in Evergreen Hills for over 50 years. She was respected, some might even say feared, by many of the residents for her sharp tongue and unwavering beliefs about what made a proper neighbor. Mrs. Gardner's polished appearance gave her an air of timelessness. With her silver hair neatly styled and her cardigan buttoned with precision, she looked as if she'd stepped out of a different era, one where things were more controlled and ordered. Her expression, however, betrayed a hint of discontent as she looked upon the Estradas with narrowed eyes. "There goes the neighborhood," she muttered under her breath, watching Jaime lift a heavy box labeled "Family Memories" into the house. A knot of resentment tightened in her chest, one that had been building with each new family that didn't quite fit her ideal of Evergreen Hills. Her husband had passed years ago, and now, it seemed, the one thing she still had control over, the sanctity of her community, was slipping away. One new neighbor at a time. The Estradas, blissfully unaware of the icy reception, continued moving in. Sofia decorated the porch with vibrant potted plants, and Jaime carefully unpacked family photos, setting them on the mantel inside. Each frame held a story of their journey, from early days in a cramped apartment to vacations where they dreamed of finding a place like this. As evening settled, the family gathered around a simple meal in their new kitchen, filled with laughter and stories of the day's small triumphs and mishaps. Ana and Mateo chattered excitedly about the upcoming school year, eager to make new friends. Sofia squeezed Jaime's hand, both of them sharing a look that said more than words ever could. They had made it. This house, this neighborhood, this life was the result of all they'd endured together. The next morning, Jaime was up early, jogging through the quiet streets as the sun rose. As he passed manicured lawns and symmetrical flower beds, he noticed Mrs. Gardner out on her porch, clutching a watering can, but watching him with a steely gaze. Jaime waved, a friendly smile crossing his face, but Mrs. Gardner's only response was a slight, dismissive nod. When he returned, Sofia was on the porch with a cup of coffee, her eyes scanning the street. She could sense the lingering weight of a gaze, as though someone was silently measuring their worthiness from a distance. Jaime chuckled as he joined her, brushing it off with a light-hearted shrug. "She probably just needs some time to adjust," he said, trying to ease Sophia's tension. But Sophia's smile faded. "I just hope that's all it is," she murmured, not wanting to voice the worry gnawing at the edges of her joy. Despite her unease, the Estradas carried on with their plans. Jaime and Sophia decided to host a small gathering, a casual get-together to meet their neighbors, hoping to start off on the right foot. They'd both grown up in tight communities where neighbors knew each other's names. Children played freely, and doors were left open. They wanted that sense of unity for their family here in Evergreen Hills. Over the next few days, they prepared with care. Sophia baked a batch of cookies, and Jaime set up a small barbecue station in the backyard. Ana painted a welcome banner with Mateo, hanging it by the entrance with pride. They printed simple invitations and left them at each house on their street, taking special care to knock on Mrs. Gardner's door. When Sophia extended an invitation, Mrs. Gardner's response was stiff, her smile thin. "Thank you, but I prefer my privacy," she said curtly. Before Sophia could reply, Mrs. Gardner closed the door, leaving Sophia standing alone on the doorstep, clutching the invitation with a sinking feeling. As Sophia walked back, a chill settled over her. She had been so eager to be part of this new community, but something in Mrs. Gardner's tone left her feeling unwelcome, like an intruder rather than a neighbor. Jaime reassured her when she shared the encounter, insisting they'd just keep being themselves. "We can't change who we are, and we shouldn't have to," he said firmly, wrapping her in a comforting hug. But as the day of the barbecue approached, Sophia noticed Mrs. Gardner's curtains twitching now and then, her shadow a silent reminder that they were being watched. The Estradas brushed it off, focusing instead on finalizing the details of their gathering. Little did they know, beneath Mrs. Gardner's cold, scrutinizing stare, resentment was simmering, animosity that had found a target in the Estrada family. When the day of the barbecue finally arrived, a mix of neighbors appeared, intrigued by the new family and eager to sample the food. Laughter and chatter filled the yard as old friends reunited and new friendships sparked. Mrs. Gardner remained indoors, her blinds drawn, her mind racing as she imagined what the Estrada's presence could mean for her beloved neighborhood. As the evening wore on, with the aroma of grilled food filling the air and guests feeling welcomed and at ease, the gathering seemed a resounding success. However, just as they began to relax into the night, they were startled by a loud knock at the front door. Jaime exchanged a confused look with Sophia before opening it. Standing there, to everyone's shock, were two police officers, their expressions unreadable. The officers at the door looked formal, their postures rigid and their faces masked with the professional detachment that comes with years of handling difficult situations. Jaime's initial surprise was quickly followed by an uneasy feeling. He stepped out onto the porch, nodding politely while the laughter and warmth from the barbecue continued in the background. "Is there an issue, officers?" he asked, keeping his voice steady. One of the officers, a middle-aged man with sharp eyes, glanced past Jaime at the crowd gathered in the backyard, then back at Jaime. "We received a call about a disturbance," he said, his tone neutral but tinged with something Jaime couldn't quite place. A neighbor expressed concerns about the noise level and safety. Jaime's heart sank as he realized what this was really about. A wave of frustration and humiliation crept up, but he kept his composure, unwilling to let the night spiral because of one person's prejudice. "It's just a small barbecue, a chance to meet some of the neighbors," Jaime explained. "We've kept the music low, and everyone here is respectful." The second officer, younger and looking somewhat uncomfortable, nodded, almost apologetically. "We understand, Mr. Estrada. We're just doing a routine check." Inside, Sophia had noticed Jaime's absence. She excused herself from the group and went to the door, her smile fading as she saw the officers. "Is everything all right?" she asked, her voice calm but her hand instinctively reaching for Jaime's. "Apparently, someone was concerned about our little get-together," Jaime said, his tone just sharp enough for Sophia to understand who might have called. She followed his gaze across the street to the dark windows of Mrs. Gardner's house, the faint outline of her silhouette barely visible. Would you like to come in and take a look? Sophia offered, gesturing toward the backyard, her voice unwavering. She wasn't going to let this ruin the evening for her family or their guests. The younger officer, sensing the family's discomfort, gave a slight nod. No need, ma'am. We just needed to confirm there was no disturbance. He turned to Jaime, a hint of understanding in his expression. Enjoy your evening. Sorry for the interruption. As the officers left, Jaime and Sophia exchanged a look, a silent understanding passing between them. They knew this incident was far from a simple noise complaint. It was an unspoken message that they were being watched, judged. Sophia took a deep breath, her gaze darkening as she looked back at Mrs. Gardner's house. Why does she hate us so much? She doesn't even know us, Sophia whispered, her voice barely audible. Jaime placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Some people fear what they don't understand, he replied softly. But we're not going to let that dictate our lives here. We worked hard for this, Sophie. They returned to their guests, determined to salvage the evening. But the vibe had subtly shifted. Their friends, having overheard bits of the encounter, offered words of encouragement and support. A few neighbors even muttering their disdain for Mrs. Gardner's behavior. Yet, a shadow of tension remained, casting a pall over what should have been a joyful celebration. As the night drew to a close, their guests departed one by one, each giving words of encouragement. Don't let her get to you, an elderly man named Mr. Lewis said, shaking Jaime's hand firmly. You're good people. Evergreen Hills could use more like you. Thank you, Jaime said, his voice tinged with gratitude. The words meant more than he could express, but deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The next morning, as Jaime and Sophia were cleaning up the remnants of the barbecue, they found a note taped to their front door. In careful, old-fashioned script, the words were neatly printed. This is not the place for your kind of gatherings. Keep things appropriate if you want peace here. Sophia's hands shook as she read the note, her face pale with shock and anger. Jaime, taking the note from her, felt a surge of protectiveness and frustration. How could such hatred thrive in a community they had only just begun to call home? We'll ignore it, he said after a moment, his voice steady, but his eyes dark with determination. We're not going to let one person's bitterness ruin this for us, Sophie. But Sophia wasn't convinced. Jaime, this isn't just one person's bitterness. It's like she thinks we don't belong here, that somehow we're intruding on her perfect world. Her voice trembled slightly, as if every word chipped away at the sense of belonging she'd tried so hard to build. They spent the day in uneasy silence, their minds preoccupied with the implications of the note and the unwelcome intrusion of the police visit. Jaime knew he had to do something, to somehow reassure Sophia that they had a right to live here, to belong. He decided to reach out to some of the more supportive neighbors, hoping to foster a sense of community that could counterbalance the hostility they'd faced. That evening, as he reached out to Mr. Lewis and a few others, they offered more than just words of comfort. They encouraged Jaime to continue engaging with the neighborhood, to attend community meetings, and to actively participate in neighborhood events. The support was heartening, yet Jaime couldn't shake the feeling of being on display, as though every move he made was under a magnifying glass. Meanwhile, Sophia found herself avoiding the front windows, feeling exposed and vulnerable, as if Mrs. Gardner's cold, disapproving gaze could pierce through the walls of their home. Anna and Mateo, sensing the tension in their parents, asked if they could invite friends over, only to be gently discouraged. Sophia couldn't bear the thought of another visit from the police, another reminder that they were under scrutiny. Late that night, as the house lay quiet, Sophia finally voiced the fear that had been eating away at her. What if she never accepts us, Jaime? What if she keeps trying to push us out? Jaime wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close. Then we'll stand our ground, he replied, his voice fierce with determination. "This is our home, Sophie. And no one, not even Mrs. Gardner, is going to take that from us." But even as he said the words, a sense of unease lingered, a dark cloud hanging over their new life in Evergreen Hills. They had come here for peace, for community, and for a place to grow. But as Jaime held Sophia close, he knew deep down that they were already in the middle of a battle they hadn't chosen, one that would require all the resilience, courage, and strength they possessed. Days passed, and while life seemed to resume a sense of normalcy for the Estrada family, there was an underlying tension that Jaime and Sophia couldn't ignore. They had moved into Evergreen Hills with the hope of building a peaceful, fulfilling life, but the neighborhood's warmth seemed superficial, marred by an invisible divide. Despite friendly nods and occasional greetings from other neighbors, there was a silent weight, a feeling of being watched and judged. One Saturday morning, Jaime decided to take a proactive step. Determined to mend fences, or at least understand the situation better, he put on a friendly smile and walked across the street to Mrs. Gardner's home. He knocked on her door, mentally rehearsing a calm and measured approach. He didn't want a confrontation. He wanted clarity. After a tense pause, the door opened a crack. Mrs. Gardner's steely eyes stared back at him, her face partially obscured by the shadow of her doorway. "Good morning, Mrs. Gardner." Jaime greeted her with as much warmth as he could muster. "I thought I'd come by and clear the air. We'd like to be a part of this community, and if there's anything we've done to make you uncomfortable, I'd love to hear about it." For a moment, there was silence. Mrs. Gardner's lips thinned as she looked Jaime up and down, assessing him like an intruder who'd overstayed his welcome. "I've lived here for over 5 decades, she finally replied, her voice cold and measured. "I've seen families come and go, but they all fit. They all understood what it meant to be a part of Evergreen Hills." Jaime clenched his jaw, keeping his tone polite. "And we want to understand that too, Mrs. Gardner. I can assure you, we're here to respect this community and contribute to it. We just want to raise our family in a place we can call home." Mrs. Gardner's eyes narrowed, a flicker of something indefinable flashing in her gaze. "Well, Evergreen Hills is a special place, Mr. Estrada. Not everyone who moves here understands that. I'll just say, some changes are harder to accept." Before Jaime could respond, she closed the door abruptly, leaving him standing on her porch, grappling with a mix of frustration and hurt. He returned home with a heavy heart, feeling that no matter what they did, acceptance from Mrs. Gardner, and perhaps others in the neighborhood, would be an uphill battle. Later that day, Sophia noticed Jaime's subdued demeanor as he sat quietly at the kitchen table, staring out the window. She placed a comforting hand on his shoulder, understanding without words the weight he carried. "I know you tried, Jaime," she said gently. "Some people they can't see beyond their own walls." Jaime nodded, attempting a faint smile. "I just thought, maybe if she saw us for who we are, she'd let go of whatever judgment she has." He paused, a hint of frustration creeping into his voice. "But I don't think it's about who we are, Sophie. I think it's about what we represent." Sophia's face softened with empathy. "Maybe, but we're here to stay. And if she won't welcome us, others will." To lift the mood, Sophia suggested they spend the afternoon at the local park. They packed a picnic, and Anna and Mateo invited a few friends from school to join. The day turned brighter as the family laughed, played games, and enjoyed the simple pleasure of being together. For a few hours, the Estradas managed to forget the shadow that Mrs. Gardner had cast over their lives. Yet, as they returned home in the evening, they were met with a stark reminder of her presence. A sign had been placed at the entrance to the neighborhood park, one they hadn't noticed before. It read, in bold letters, "Evergreen Hills values its traditions and expects all residents to uphold them." Jaime stared at the sign, a familiar tension building in his chest. Sophia's hand found his, squeezing gently as if to reassure him. "It's just a sign," she whispered, her tone firm. "It doesn't change who we are." But as they walked past the sign, each step toward their home felt heavier than the last. The meaning behind the words lingered, a reminder that in Mrs. Gardner's eyes, they were still outsiders. The following morning, Anna came into the kitchen with a hesitant expression, holding a note she'd found taped to the gate. Jaime took it from her, reading the carefully printed words. "Respect our neighborhood. Keep your gatherings private." Anna's face showed a mix of hurt and confusion. "Why would someone leave this, Dad?" Jaime looked down at his daughter, his heart aching. She was 14, old enough to sense prejudice, but young enough to feel crushed by it. He ruffled her hair, forcing a reassuring smile. "Sometimes, Anna, people don't know how to handle change, but it's not our job to make everyone happy. We just have to be ourselves." Anna nodded, her expression contemplative, and Jaime felt a surge of protectiveness. He wanted his children to feel pride in who they were, not to carry the weight of someone else's prejudice. Determined to stand his ground, Jaime decided they needed allies. He began reaching out to more neighbors, inviting a few to coffee, sharing friendly conversations over the fence, and attending a local book club that Sophia had recently joined. With each interaction, they found that while Mrs. Gardner's influence loomed large, she did not represent everyone. Some neighbors were welcoming, openly supportive of the Estradas, and as time passed, they began to feel small glimmers of acceptance. However, Mrs. Gardner's disapproval remained an ever-present shadow. She was a master of subtle gestures, her cold stares, whispered conversations with other longtime residents, and, as Sophia soon discovered, passive-aggressive notes left on their doorstep. One day, Sophia found a small typed note that read, "Evergreen Hills thrives on respect and tradition. Please remember that." It was infuriating. Sophia clutched the note, feeling her patience wear thin. "How long will we have to put up with this?" she asked Jaime that evening, her voice wavering. Jaime looked at her, a fire in his eyes. "As long as it takes, Sophie. We're not backing down. This is our home too." That night, as they sat in their living room, a knock sounded at the door. Jaime's heart skipped, wondering if it was another neighbor coming with yet another veiled warning. But when he opened the door, he was surprised to see Mr. Lewis, the elderly man who had shown them kindness after the barbecue incident. "Evening, Jaime," Mr. Lewis greeted him, offering a warm smile. "Just wanted to check in and see how you all were doing." Jaime invited him in, grateful for the support. As they chatted, Mr. Lewis's voice took on a serious tone. "I've known Eleanor Gardner for many years. She's not used to change, and she's a stubborn one, I'll give you that. But she doesn't speak for all of us. Don't let her get in your head." Sophia joined them, her eyes brightening at Mr. Lewis's words. "Thank you. It means a lot, really." Mr. Lewis nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "This neighborhood has room for everyone. It'll just take some time to change the minds of those who still think otherwise. You keep doing what you're doing. You'll win them over, little by little." After Mr. Lewis left, Jaime and Sophia sat in silence, feeling the impact of his words. They were reassured, but a sense of unease lingered. They knew that Mrs. Gardner wasn't finished, that her resentment was building, simmering beneath the surface, waiting for an outlet. They had won a small victory tonight, but the battle for acceptance in Evergreen Hills was far from over. The days continued, each marked by small victories and subtle tensions. The Estradas became more familiar faces in Evergreen Hills, but every new interaction felt like a test. Would they find a welcoming neighbor or another silent gatekeeper of the old ways like Mrs. Gardner? Despite these challenges, Jaime and Sophia held strong. They joined neighborhood activities and volunteered at local events, hoping to show their dedication to the community. One sunny afternoon, the Estradas decided to host a small outdoor gathering for the local families they had grown closest to. Jaime had set up a portable soccer net for the kids, While Sophia arranged a snack table with freshly baked treats, the sounds of laughter and friendly conversation filled their backyard, a pleasant contrast to the tension that had often hung over them since moving in. The children played happily on the lawn, racing and laughing without a care in the world. It was a simple joy that made Sophia's heart swell with pride and love. She felt a momentary relief, as though they had finally managed to carve out a little corner of peace in Evergreen Hills. But peace, it seemed, was not something Mrs. Gardner would allow them for long. From her window, Mrs. Gardner watched the gathering unfold, her gaze sharp and unyielding. Her hands clenched around the lace curtains as she observed the Estradas laughing and mingling with her longtime neighbors. It was as though her worst fear was playing out before her eyes. Outsiders slowly working their way into the heart of her cherished community. Unable to hold back her growing frustration, Mrs. Gardner picked up the phone and dialed the Evergreen Hills Neighborhood Council, a group she had led for years, shaping its policies and enforcing what she believed were the values of the community. Her voice was tight with irritation as she spoke with the council president, Mr. Nichols, a man known for his diplomatic nature. "I don't think you're seeing the full picture here," Mrs. Gardner insisted, her tone firm. "Evergreen Hills has standards, and we need to ensure they're upheld. This is not the place for such disruptions." Mr. Nichols, taken aback by her intensity, hesitated. "Eleanor, we've received no complaints from other residents. By all accounts, the Estradas are well liked. They're respectful, they're active in the community, and they're bringing fresh energy. Isn't that what we want?" Mrs. Gardner's voice grew colder. "It's not about who they are. It's about preserving the culture we've spent decades building here. I expected more vigilance from you, Robert." Mr. Nichols sighed, torn between his respect for Mrs. Gardner and his own belief in inclusivity. "Eleanor, times change. Evergreen Hills has to evolve too. Maybe it's time to welcome that." She hung up, her frustration boiling over. In her mind, Mr. Nichols' reluctance to take action was a betrayal of everything Evergreen Hills stood for. But Mrs. Gardner wasn't about to surrender her ideals so easily. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over her pristine garden, she made a decision. The next morning, Sophia found a letter slipped under their door. She opened it, her brow furrowing as she read the contents aloud. "To the Estrada family, while we welcome all newcomers, it's important to respect the traditions and norms of Evergreen Hills. Recent gatherings have disrupted the peaceful environment that we hold dear. We ask that you maintain a quieter presence to ensure harmony among residents." The note was signed simply, "The Neighborhood Council," though the style of the letter left little doubt in Sophia's mind about its true author. Jaime clenched his fists, feeling a simmering anger that was hard to contain. "This has to be Mrs. Gardner's doing. She can't stand seeing us make connections here, so now she's hiding behind the council to intimidate us." Sophia placed a calming hand on his arm. "We can't let her win, Jaime. We're part of this community, and we have every right to enjoy our lives here." Jaime took a deep breath, nodding as he released some of the tension. "You're right. We'll keep doing what we're doing. But we need to be careful. She's not going to stop." The letter only strengthened their resolve. Over the following weeks, they continued building relationships with their neighbors, ignoring Mrs. Gardner's passive-aggressive tactics. They attended local events, helped organize a neighborhood cleanup, and even signed up to assist with the upcoming fall festival. However, each act of kindness, each attempt to blend into the community, only seemed to intensify Mrs. Gardner's hostility. She began holding secretive meetings with a small group of like-minded residents, planting seeds of doubt about the Estradas, painting them as disruptive outsiders who threatened the peaceful nature of Evergreen Hills. One evening, as Jaime was returning from a late night at work, he noticed something unusual. Several of Mrs. Gardner's group were standing near her front lawn, their voices low but urgent. He parked his car quietly and approached, catching snippets of their conversation. "It's just not the same since they moved in," one woman whispered, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "We don't know what they're bringing into the neighborhood." Mrs. Gardner nodded, her voice steely. This isn't the time to sit idly by. We must make it clear that we expect certain standards. Otherwise, we risk losing what makes Evergreen Hills special. Jaime felt his stomach twist as he listened, the subtle hints of prejudice sharpening into unmistakable hostility. He wanted to confront them right there, to demand why they couldn't simply let his family live in peace. But something held him back, a sense that rushing in might only make things worse. Instead, he quietly turned and returned home, his mind racing with frustration and uncertainty. That night, he shared what he'd overheard with Sophia. They're not just talking, Sophie. They're planning something. Mrs. Gardner isn't going to stop until she finds a way to force us out. Sophia's face tightened, her jaw set with determination. Then we'll keep standing up to her. We're not going anywhere, Jaime. This is our home now, and she doesn't get to decide who belongs here. Jaime felt a surge of pride at her resolve. Despite everything, Sophia remained steadfast, unwilling to let Mrs. Gardner's prejudice tarnish their new life. He took her hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. We'll face whatever comes. Together. A few days later, their resolve would be put to the test. It was a crisp autumn morning when Sophia received a call from the school. Mateo had been involved in an altercation. Heart pounding, she rushed to the school, where she found her son sitting quietly in the principal's office, his face a mix of frustration and sadness. What happened, Mateo? She asked softly, her heart breaking at the sight of her usually cheerful son looking so dejected. Mateo's voice was barely a whisper. Some kids were saying things about us, Mom. They said we don't belong here, that we're ruining their neighborhood. His eyes filled with unshed tears. I told them it wasn't true, but they wouldn't listen. Sophia felt a surge of anger mingled with heartbreak. The hostility they'd endured from Mrs. Gardner had somehow trickled down, poisoning even the minds of the younger generation. Kneeling down, she hugged Mateo tightly, feeling the weight of their struggle pressing down on her shoulders. We're going to be okay, sweetheart, she whispered fiercely. We belong here just as much as anyone else. But as she held her son, Sophia knew that their journey in Evergreen Hills was becoming more challenging than she had ever anticipated. The unseen battle for acceptance was now affecting their children, and Sophia could feel her patience wearing thin. When she shared the incident with Jaime that evening, he was devastated. They had hoped to shield their children from the brunt of the prejudice they faced, but it seemed the bitterness ran deeper than they'd realized. We can't let this go on, Sophia, Jaime said, his voice filled with conviction. It's time to stand up, not just for us, but for Anna and Mateo. We'll confront Mrs. Gardner if we have to, but we won't allow her or anyone else to make us feel like outsiders. Sophia nodded, her own determination hardening. They would do whatever it took to protect their family, to secure a place where their children could feel safe and accepted, and they would no longer stay silent in the face of such quiet, insidious hostility. Together, they decided that the next time Mrs. Gardner crossed a line, they would be ready. The days after Mateo's incident at school were tense for the Estrada family. The air in their home was thick with an unspoken worry, a feeling that something essential was slipping away. Jaime and Sophia tried their best to keep things light, to reassure Anna and Mateo, but the hurt was still evident in their children's eyes. They could no longer shield them from the weight of Mrs. Gardner's influence over the neighborhood. That weekend, the family decided to attend the Evergreen Hills Fall Festival, a yearly celebration of the season with games, food stalls, and live music organized by the neighborhood council. For Jaime and Sophia, it was a chance to stand tall in the face of adversity, to show the community they wouldn't be driven away. They wanted Anna and Mateo to experience a sense of normalcy and to show them that they still belonged here, no matter what anyone else thought. As they entered the festival grounds, they were greeted by a handful of friendly faces. Mr. Lewis waved them over to his booth, where he was selling handcrafted wooden toys. The warmth of his welcome was like a balm to their bruised spirits. "It's good to see you all here," Mr. Lewis said, a reassuring twinkle in his eye. "Don't let anyone make you feel unwelcome. You're as much a part of Evergreen Hills as anyone else." Jaime smiled gratefully, the tension in his shoulders easing a bit. "Thank you, Mr. Lewis. We needed to hear that." Sophia nodded in agreement, glancing around at the crowd. She saw Mrs. Gardner standing nearby, flanked by several of her loyal friends. They were whispering, their eyes darting toward the Estradas with barely disguised disapproval. Sophia felt a flicker of anger but steadied herself, determined not to let Mrs. Gardner's presence ruin the day. The children ran off to explore the festival, their laughter filling the air as they joined other kids in a sack race. For a moment, it felt like things were normal, like they were just another family enjoying a community event. But the peace didn't last. As Sophia and Jaime walked through the festival, they noticed subtle signs of exclusion. Some neighbors avoided eye contact, others offered curt nods, and a few even pulled their children away from Ana and Mateo, as if they were somehow dangerous. Jaime clenched his jaw, feeling the sting of rejection, but he forced himself to focus on the few who offered genuine smiles and kind words. Eventually, they found themselves near the food stalls, where Mrs. Gardner was hosting a small community standards booth. Her face lit up with a saccharine smile when she saw them approaching. "Well, if it isn't the Estradas," she said, her tone dripping with false sweetness. "Enjoying the festival, I hope." Jaime held Sophia's hand tightly, steadying himself as he nodded. "Yes, we are. It's a wonderful event." Mrs. Gardner's smile tightened, a glint of condescension in her eyes. "I just wanted to make sure everyone here understands the values we hold dear in Evergreen Hills," she said, gesturing to the pamphlets on her table. "We have a tradition of respect and order, you know. Some people take that very seriously." Jaime's patience snapped. He stepped forward, meeting Mrs. Gardner's gaze with unflinching resolve. "With all due respect, Mrs. Gardner, we're part of this community too. And we intend to uphold the same values of respect and kindness. That includes respecting each other's differences." Mrs. Gardner's eyes widened, a flash of surprise flickering across her face before she composed herself. "I'm sure you mean well, Mr. Estrada, but sometimes actions speak louder than words." Sophia stepped up beside him, her voice calm but firm. "And our actions have shown nothing but respect for this neighborhood. We love it here, and we want to contribute. But we won't tolerate being treated like we don't belong." A small crowd had started to gather around them, the tension between the two sides palpable. Some onlookers exchanged uncomfortable glances, while others looked on with expressions of curiosity and silent support. Mrs. Gardner's smile faltered as she realized she no longer held the unwavering support of everyone present. Mr. Lewis, standing nearby, crossed his arms and spoke up. "I think the Estradas have shown us all what it means to be good neighbors. Maybe it's time we appreciated that, instead of looking for reasons to divide us." Several others murmured their agreement, and Mrs. Gardner's face flushed with a mixture of frustration and embarrassment. She seemed momentarily speechless, her usual confident demeanor shaken by the unexpected show of support for the Estradas. Not wanting to prolong the confrontation, Jaime nodded to those around him and guided Sophia away from the booth, his heart pounding. They had stood up to Mrs. Gardner, but he knew this was far from over. There was a subtle power struggle at play, one that would take more than a few words to overcome. Later that evening, as the family returned home, Ana approached her parents, her eyes bright with newfound determination. "I'm proud of you, Mom and Dad," she said softly. "You didn't let her push you around." Jaime smiled, pulling her into a hug. "We're proud of you too, Ana. And we want you and Mateo to know that we'll always stand up for what's right, even when it's hard." As they sat down for dinner, there was a sense of unity within the Estrada family, a feeling that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The next morning, they found yet another note taped to their door. This one was different from the others, shorter, more threatening. It read, "You may have won some of the neighbors, but you won't change Evergreen Hills. Consider this your final warning." Sophia's hands shook as she read the note, her face pale. She glanced at Jaime, her eyes filled with worry. "This is more than just petty hostility, Jaime. I'm starting to feel unsafe." Jaime's face darkened, his protective instincts flaring. "If they think we're going to back down because of a cowardly note, they're wrong." Determined not to be intimidated, Jaime reported the note to the local police, explaining the ongoing harassment they had faced. The officer who took their statement listened with empathy, assuring them that any further incidents would be taken seriously. It was a small comfort, but Sophia couldn't shake the feeling that Mrs. Gardner's resentment had crossed a line, morphing into something more sinister. That evening, Mr. Lewis came by their home, carrying a small box of freshly baked cookies as a gesture of solidarity. "I heard about what happened at the festival," he said, his voice gentle. "You did the right thing, standing up for yourselves. Don't let Eleanor Gardner's bitterness get to you." Jaime accepted the cookies, a grateful smile on his face. "Thank you, Mr. Lewis. It means a lot to know we have friends here." Mr. Lewis nodded, his expression somber. "Eleanor may have been a pillar of this community once, but times change, and I think it's high time she realized that she can't hold on to the past forever." Sophia, touched by his words, reached out to hug Mr. Lewis. "We're so grateful for your support. It's been hard, but knowing we have allies like you makes all the difference." As the night wore on, Jaime and Sophia sat together, their hearts heavy but resolute. They knew that this fight was about more than just finding acceptance in a new neighborhood. It was about standing up for their family, their values, and their right to belong. Evergreen Hills was their home, and they would continue to defend it against any shadow of hatred that threatened their peace. With each passing day, the Estradas grew stronger, bolstered by the support of those who saw beyond Mrs. Gardner's prejudices. The confrontation at the festival had ignited a spark within them, a reminder of the resilience that had brought them this far. They would not be silenced, nor would they allow fear to dictate their lives. As they looked out into the quiet, moonlit street that night, a sense of calm settled over them. They had faced the shadows and come out stronger, and they knew, no matter what lay ahead, they would continue to stand together, unbreakable, undeterred, and unafraid. In the days following the festival, a new rhythm began to emerge for the Estrada family. The subtle hostility that had lingered in Evergreen Hills began to shift as more neighbors reached out, encouraged by the courage they had seen in Jaime and Sophia. Small gestures of kindness, a neighbor bringing over a pie, a wave from across the street, were symbols of support that lifted their spirits. It seemed that their stance at the festival had sown seeds of change, and people were finally recognizing the unjust treatment they had endured. Yet, for all the goodwill they received, Mrs. Gardner's resentment only seemed to grow. The warnings, the letters, and the whispered conversations had failed to drive the Estradas away, and her patience had worn thin. She was losing her grip over the community she had once commanded, and to her, the Estradas were a threat that needed to be dealt with. Then, one evening, when the air was thick with the scent of autumn leaves and the sky painted in deep, bruised hues, the storm finally broke. It was a quiet night, and the Estradas were finishing dinner when there was a loud, insistent knock at the door. Jaime exchanged a wary look with Sophia, feeling a familiar sense of foreboding. He opened the door, only to find Mrs. Gardner standing on their porch, flanked by two of her closest allies from the neighborhood council. Her face was set in a hard line, her eyes blazing with barely concealed anger. "We need to talk," she said curtly, not waiting for an invitation as she stepped into their entryway. Jaime's voice was steady but firm. "If this is about another complaint, Mrs. Gardner, I think we've heard enough." Mrs. Gardner's gaze was cold as she looked around their home, as though searching for signs of everything she disapproved of. "This isn't just a complaint, Mr. Estrada. This is about the future of our neighborhood. Evergreen Hills has been a place of harmony, of tradition, long before you arrived. Jaime folded his arms, his patience waning. And we're here to respect that. But respect is a two-way street, Mrs. Gardner. One of Mrs. Gardner's allies, a tall man named Mr. Fletcher, stepped forward. Mrs. Gardner is right, he said, his tone as icy as hers. You've caused a division in this community. There's a sense of unrest, and it didn't start until you moved in. Sophia's voice, calm but edged with determination, cut through the tension. We've done nothing but try to be part of this community. We've faced harassment, exclusion, and threats, all because we had the courage to stand up to prejudice. Mrs. Gardner's expression twisted, and for the first time, her polished mask cracked, revealing a glimpse of the bitterness that lay beneath. You don't understand, do you? She sneered. This neighborhood has a standard. It's not just about fitting in. It's about preserving the legacy that people like me worked hard to build. Jaime felt a surge of anger, his voice rising. And people like us don't belong in that legacy? Is that what you're saying? Mrs. Gardner's silence was answer enough, her gaze unwavering, filled with disdain. The room fell into a tense silence, the weight of her words pressing down on them like a dark cloud. At that moment, a voice spoke from the doorway, breaking the oppressive silence. Mr. Lewis, who had seen Mrs. Gardner enter the Estrada's home, had quietly stepped inside, drawn by the confrontation. His gaze was sharp as he looked from Mrs. Gardner to Jaime, his voice filled with quiet strength. Eleanor, you're wrong, he said simply. Evergreen Hills isn't yours to control. It belongs to everyone who calls it home, and the Estradas have more than earned their place here. Mrs. Gardner's face paled, her eyes narrowing. You've always been too soft, Robert. That's why the neighborhood is slipping. People are forgetting what it used to be, what it stood for. Mr. Lewis shook his head, a mixture of sadness and disappointment in his eyes. No, Eleanor. It's people like you who are keeping this place in the past. You're the one causing division, not the Estradas. And it's time you realize that the world is changing. Either you change with it, or you'll be left behind. Mrs. Gardner's allies shifted uncomfortably, the conviction in Mr. Lewis's voice making them doubt the path they had chosen. But Mrs. Gardner was not one to back down so easily. She squared her shoulders, her voice trembling with anger as she spoke. If this is what Evergreen Hills is becoming, then maybe it's time for a return to order, she said, her tone laced with an unspoken threat. With that, she turned on her heel and strode out, her allies following her with hesitant glances back at Mr. Lewis and the Estradas. The door slammed behind them, leaving an uneasy quiet in its wake. Jaime exhaled, the tension slowly easing from his shoulders. He turned to Mr. Lewis, his gratitude evident in his expression. Thank you, Mr. Lewis. I don't know what we would have done without your support. Mr. Lewis gave a small, weary smile. You would have stood your ground, just like you've been doing all along. But I'm glad I was here to see the truth come to light. Sophia nodded, her voice soft. It's people like you who remind us that there is goodness here, that this place can still be a home. The next day, word of the confrontation spread quickly through Evergreen Hills. Neighbors began reaching out, some expressing support, others cautiously neutral. There were murmurs of disapproval toward Mrs. Gardner's behavior, as her grip over the community seemed to weaken. Little by little, the tide was turning. Later that week, the Estradas received an invitation to a special neighborhood meeting. It was an unusual gesture, one that hinted at a possible resolution to the tensions that had plagued their lives since moving in. When Jaime and Sophia arrived at the community hall, they were met with a mixed crowd of neighbors, all gathered with a tense but hopeful air. Mrs. Gardner sat at the front, her face expressionless, a silent storm brewing beneath her calm facade. As the meeting began, Mr. Nichols, the council president, addressed the room. We're here today to discuss recent events that have affected our community. It's no secret that we've faced division, and it's clear that some of us have very different visions for the future of Evergreen Hills. He glanced at Mrs. Gardner, his expression firm. While we respect the history of our neighborhood, we must also respect each other. Evergreen Hills has grown, and so has our community. If we're to move forward, we must be willing to embrace the changes that come with it. Several neighbors nodded, murmuring their agreement. Jaime felt a surge of relief and pride as he looked around, seeing faces that had once been indifferent, now showing signs of understanding. Mrs. Gardner, however, refused to stay silent. She stood, her voice filled with indignation. So, we're just supposed to let everything we built be erased? Let outsiders dictate what our neighborhood becomes? A voice from the back of the room called out, firm and clear. This isn't about erasing anything, Eleanor. It's about welcoming the future. The Estradas are good people, and they've proven that time and again. A ripple of agreement spread through the crowd, and for the first time, Mrs. Gardner seemed to realize that she was outnumbered. Her influence was waning, the power she had wielded for decades slipping through her fingers. Jaime and Sophia exchanged a hopeful glance, feeling a weight lift from their shoulders. They had fought long and hard for this moment, and it seemed the community was finally beginning to understand. Mr. Nichols concluded the meeting with a resolution. Evergreen Hills would officially adopt a new set of community guidelines focused on inclusivity and respect for all residents, old and new. It was a symbolic step, but one that carried the promise of a brighter, more welcoming future. As the meeting adjourned, neighbors came up to Jaime and Sophia, offering words of support and apologies for their previous silence. The tide had finally turned, and the Estradas were no longer strangers in their own neighborhood. Mrs. Gardner left the hall in silence, her face a mask of bitterness. The community she had tried so hard to control had moved on without her, embracing a future she refused to accept. For the first time since they'd moved to Evergreen Hills, the Estradas felt truly at home. They had stood their ground, weathered the storm, and emerged stronger than ever. As they walked home that night, hand in hand, they knew that while the journey had been difficult, it was one worth taking. With the neighborhood meeting behind them, the Estradas finally began to experience a genuine sense of belonging in Evergreen Hills. In the days that followed, Jaime and Sophia noticed subtle but powerful shifts in the way people interacted with them. Neighbors who had previously avoided them now waved warmly as they passed by, and several even stopped by with small tokens of goodwill, freshly baked bread, home-canned preserves, and handwritten notes of welcome. The change was heartening, and the Estradas' home started to feel like a true sanctuary rather than a battleground. Ana and Mateo noticed the shift too, their smiles brighter and their laughter more carefree. The sense of peace that had seemed so out of reach was finally settling around them, and the family relished every moment of it. But there was still one figure in the neighborhood who couldn't let go of her resentment: Mrs. Gardner. One chilly morning, Sophia and Jaime were tidying their garden, preparing it for winter, when they spotted Mrs. Gardner outside. She was standing on her porch, watching them with an inscrutable expression. It was a familiar sight, yet something about her demeanor was different. Her shoulders, usually held high with pride, seemed to sag, and her face bore an unfamiliar weariness. Jaime, ever the peacemaker, decided to seize the moment. "Good morning, Mrs. Gardner," he called out, offering a gentle nod. Mrs. Gardner hesitated, her gaze flickering as if she was struggling with some inner conflict. After a pause, she nodded back, but her expression remained guarded. Sophia noticed the brief exchange and nudged Jaime. "Maybe we should talk to her," Sophia whispered, sensing that Mrs. Gardner's usual sharpness was replaced by something softer, almost vulnerable. Jaime nodded, and together they walked across the street to her porch. Mrs. Gardner stiffened as they approached, but she didn't retreat into her home as she had so many times before. "Mrs. Gardner," Sophia began, her voice gentle, "we wanted to check in on you. We've all been through a lot these past few weeks and, well, we thought it might be good to clear the air." Mrs. Gardner's eyes clouded, and for a moment, Sophia thought she might lash out. But instead, the older woman looked away, her voice barely a whisper. "You all think I'm the villain in this story, don't you?" Sophia and Jaime exchanged a surprised glance. They hadn't expected this candid admission, and it softened their own anger. "We don't see it that way," Jaime replied quietly. "We know change is hard. We came here because we wanted a fresh start, a place to raise our kids and be part of a community. We never wanted conflict." Mrs. Gardner's gaze softened slightly, but the lines of bitterness on her face were still visible. I've lived here my whole life. This neighborhood has been my whole world. Seeing everything change so quickly, it feels like I'm losing a part of myself." Sophia took a deep breath, empathy replacing the resentment she had carried. "We understand that, Mrs. Gardner, but the world is always changing, and sometimes holding on to the past can make us miss out on the good things that come with it." Mrs. Gardner's expression wavered, her eyes misting as she looked out over the neighborhood. "I've seen people come and go, but I always knew them, trusted them. And then you arrived, and suddenly everything felt different, like I was an outsider in my own home." Jaime nodded, understanding the fear she was grappling with. "We never wanted to take anything from you, Mrs. Gardner. We just wanted to build something new alongside you. There's room here for everyone, and you're an important part of this community too." The silence that followed was heavy but healing, as if years of pent-up tension were slowly unraveling between them. Mrs. Gardner's shoulders slumped, and she looked at Jaime and Sophia with a mixture of regret and longing. "I don't know if I can change," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Sophia reached out, gently placing her hand on Mrs. Gardner's arm. "Change is hard, but it doesn't have to happen all at once. We don't need you to be someone you're not. We just want to live here in peace, to be part of a community that supports each other." Mrs. Gardner looked down at Sophia's hand, and for the first time, she didn't pull away. Her voice was tinged with sorrow as she said, "I've caused so much pain, haven't I?" Jaime nodded slowly, not wanting to dismiss the hurt she had inflicted, but also sensing the remorse in her words. "Yes, but it's never too late to make things right. Small steps can make a big difference." Mrs. Gardner's eyes filled with tears she didn't bother to wipe away. She looked out over the neighborhood, her gaze distant as if she was sifting through memories. "I'll try," she murmured, a hint of resolve in her voice. "I don't know if I'll ever get used to all these changes, but I'll try." Jaime and Sophia exchanged a look of relief, feeling that, perhaps for the first time, they were reaching the real person behind Mrs. Gardner's stoic facade. They knew that she might never fully embrace them, but this moment of vulnerability was a step forward, a fragile truce that carried the promise of a brighter future. Over the next few weeks, Mrs. Gardner's actions matched her words, albeit slowly. She began participating in small neighborhood events, keeping to herself, but offering polite nods and occasional small talk with the Estradas. Her presence was reserved, but the wall of hostility she had built was beginning to crack. One crisp Saturday morning, Jaime found Mrs. Gardner standing near the community garden, her fingers brushing a lavender bush. She looked up, catching Jaime's eye, and hesitated before speaking. "I was thinking, perhaps we could plant some marigolds here next spring," she said, her voice tentative. Jaime's face broke into a warm smile. "That sounds like a wonderful idea. Marigolds would add such a vibrant color." Mrs. Gardner nodded, her expression softening just a fraction. It was a simple exchange, but for Jaime, it felt like a small miracle, one he would cherish. As winter settled over Evergreen Hills, the neighborhood seemed to embrace a newfound sense of unity. People no longer whispered about the Estradas or cast wary glances. Instead, they waved and shared small conversations at the mailbox or the local coffee shop. The Estradas were no longer seen as strangers. They were simply another family in the community, bound by the same dreams and hopes. Sophia often reflected on the journey they had taken to reach this point. They had endured prejudice and hostility, but they had also witnessed acts of kindness that reaffirmed their belief in the goodness of people. It was a story of resilience and growth, one they would carry with them as a reminder that change, though difficult, could lead to something beautiful. And as for Mrs. Gardner, she remained a complex figure, her presence still tinged with a reluctance to fully embrace the future. Yet, in her quiet way, she had taken the first steps toward acceptance, and the community had begun to heal around her. The transformation was fragile, but it held promise, a promise of a brighter tomorrow, shaped by the courage to change and the willingness to forgive. As winter turned to spring, the warmth returned not only to the air, but to the hearts of the people in Evergreen Hills. The community had blossomed, much like the new blooms sprouting around the neighborhood, with an atmosphere that felt lighter and more welcoming. For the first time since they had moved in, the Estradas felt like they truly belonged. Jaime and Sophia embraced their roles within the community, joining hands with neighbors to plan events and support local causes. They found themselves becoming close friends with people they never expected to, including those who, months ago, had seemed distant or indifferent. Slowly but surely, the neighborhood had begun to feel like home. One sunny afternoon, the Estradas were invited to participate in a special community project, the rejuvenation of the local park. The once vibrant park had fallen into disrepair over the years, and the neighborhood council decided it was time to bring it back to life. The entire community rallied around the idea, envisioning a space where families could gather, children could play, and neighbors could share moments of connection. Jaime volunteered to help organize, and Sophia offered to lead a team to plant flowers and greenery. Ana and Mateo were thrilled, joining other neighborhood kids to paint colorful benches and install new playground equipment. The project became a symbol of unity, a testament to the neighborhood's new spirit of inclusivity and cooperation. On the first day of the park restoration, Jaime was surprised to see Mrs. Gardner arrive, carrying a small potted marigold plant. She walked with quiet determination, her usual aloof demeanor softened. Jaime and Sophia exchanged a glance, sensing a change in her that went beyond a simple gesture. Mrs. Gardner approached them, offering a hesitant smile. I thought these marigolds might add some color to the park, she said, her voice softer than usual. They've always been my favorite. Jaime returned her smile warmly. They're perfect, Mrs. Gardner. Thank you for contributing. Sophia stepped forward, gesturing to a freshly prepared flower bed. Why don't you plant them here, by the entrance? They'll be the first flowers people see when they arrive. Mrs. Gardner seemed momentarily taken aback, as if unsure whether she deserved such an honor. But after a moment she nodded, carefully setting the pot down and kneeling to dig the soil. Jaime and Sophia joined her, working in comfortable silence as they planted the marigolds side by side. It was a simple act, yet it felt monumental. For so long, Mrs. Gardner had been a figure of division in the neighborhood, but today she was part of the team, working alongside people she had once kept at arm's length. Jaime and Sophia could feel the quiet shift, the sense that forgiveness was slowly weaving its way into the fabric of Evergreen Hills. The day wore on, and as the sun began to set, the park was transformed. Children's laughter echoed as they tested out the new swings. Parents sat on freshly painted benches, and neighbors admired the new flower beds. Mrs. Gardner stayed longer than anyone expected, watching the scene with a mixture of pride and quiet introspection. Before she left, she approached Jaime and Sophia, her voice barely above a whisper. I know I haven't always been kind to you. I realize now that I was wrong. My fear of change blinded me, and for that, I am truly sorry. Sophia's eyes softened as she reached out, placing a comforting hand on Mrs. Gardner's arm. Thank you, Mrs. Gardner. It takes courage to admit that, and it means a lot to us. Jaime nodded in agreement. We appreciate it, and we're glad you're here with us today. This park is as much yours as it is ours." Mrs. Gardner gave a small, sad smile. "Perhaps it's time I embrace the new Evergreen Hills. It's not easy, but I think I'm ready to try." The park restoration became a turning point for the entire community. Word spread quickly of Mrs. Gardner's apology and her efforts to join in, and the story became a source of inspiration for others. Neighbors who had once kept their distance were now eager to join hands with the Estradas, encouraged by Mrs. Gardner's change of heart. A few weeks after the park project, the neighborhood council announced a spring block party to celebrate the community's newfound unity. It was a chance for everyone to come together, to share stories, and to welcome spring with open hearts. The Estradas eagerly joined the planning, excited to make the event a memorable one for all. When the day of the block party arrived, the streets were alive with music, laughter, and the scent of delicious food. Tables were set up along the sidewalks, laden with dishes from different cultures, each representing the diversity that had slowly woven its way into Evergreen Hills. The Estradas brought tamales and a traditional Mexican punch, a tribute to their heritage that they were proud to share. Sophia spotted Mrs. Gardner across the street, standing alone as she looked at the cheerful scene. This time, she didn't hesitate. Sophia walked over and invited her to their table, extending a warm smile. To Sophia's delight, Mrs. Gardner accepted, settling into a seat with a quiet sigh. Jaime offered her a tamale, and although she seemed hesitant at first, she took a small bite. A moment later, she looked up with a glimmer of surprise. "This is delicious," she admitted, her expression softening. Jaime grinned. "I'm glad you like it. These are a family recipe." As the night went on, Mrs. Gardner remained at their table, laughing at Mateo's jokes and listening to Anna's stories about school. For the first time, she seemed at ease, as if she had finally found a place among her neighbors. The Estradas knew that healing would take time, but they could see the progress all around them. Evergreen Hills was transforming, evolving into a community that honored its past while embracing the future. Neighbors who had once avoided each other now shared stories, food, and laughter. Children played freely, unaware of the struggles that had once divided the adults around them. And in the middle of it all was Mrs. Gardner, her icy exterior slowly melting, a hint of warmth in her eyes as she watched the neighborhood she had once tried to control slip into a beautiful, diverse harmony. She still held her values close, but she was learning to make room for others, to share her world with people who brought new colors, new flavors, and new dreams to Evergreen Hills. By the end of the evening, as the block party began to wind down, Mrs. Gardner surprised Jaime and Sophia by pulling them aside. Her voice was soft, but filled with an unexpected gratitude. "Thank you, both of you, for not giving up on me. I know I don't deserve it, but thank you." Sophia's eyes filled with compassion. "We all deserve a chance to grow, Mrs. Gardner, and we're glad to be on this journey with you." As the Estradas walked home under the starry sky, they felt a profound sense of peace. They had come to Evergreen Hills as strangers, met with hostility and prejudice, but through resilience and kindness, they had become part of the community. They had weathered the storm, and in doing so, they had helped bring about a season of renewal, a chance for everyone, even Mrs. Gardner, to start anew. This part highlights the completion of Mrs. Gardner's gradual change of heart and the neighborhood's shift toward true unity. Let me know if you'd like to proceed with Part 9, the final segment. The block party marked a turning point in Evergreen Hills. In the weeks that followed, a sense of harmony settled over the neighborhood, a quiet, enduring peace that had been forged through resilience, understanding, and the courage to change. The transformation was not just physical. It was felt in every smile exchanged, every wave from a neighbor, and every shared moment that brought people closer together. The Estradas continued to play an active role in their community, becoming a source of warmth and support for others. They organized potlucks, participated in community projects, and became trusted friends to many. They were no longer seen as outsiders, but as an integral part of Evergreen Hills' evolving identity. Mrs. Gardner, too, found her place within this new community. While her transformation had been slow and, at times, painful, she had reached a point where she could appreciate the diversity around her. She joined neighborhood meetings and even offered her time at local events, her presence a testament to the power of human connection and the capacity for growth at any stage of life. Her marigolds thrived in the community garden, a symbol of her quiet contribution and her acceptance of change. One morning, as Jaime and Sophia sat on their porch, enjoying the gentle spring breeze, they reflected on their journey. They had come to Evergreen Hills with a simple dream, to find a place where their family could thrive. But what they had found was much more profound. They had discovered the power of community, the importance of resilience, and the beauty that comes when people from different backgrounds come together with open hearts. Looking back, Sophia felt a deep gratitude. They had faced challenges, yet those very struggles had brought about a deeper understanding, not only in their neighbors, but within themselves. The journey had changed them, making them stronger and more compassionate, and it had opened a door to friendships they would cherish for life. As Jaime and Sophia knew, their story wasn't just about overcoming adversity. It was a reminder of the power we all have to make a difference in our own communities. We each have the choice to stand up against prejudice, to extend kindness to those who are new or different, and to create spaces where everyone feels they belong. Let's carry this story as a reminder that even small acts of kindness can spark great change. In a world that sometimes feels divided, we can all choose to build bridges, open doors, and offer a hand to those around us. The journey may not always be easy, but every step toward understanding and acceptance brings us closer to a world where everyone is valued and respected. If this story touched your heart, consider sharing it with someone who might need a little inspiration. And if you believe in the power of kindness and community, join us for more stories that celebrate resilience, compassion, and the beauty of the human spirit. Subscribe to Inspiring Hearts on YouTube, where we share stories that uplift, unite, and remind us of the goodness within us all. Together, let's keep spreading love, one story at a time. Thank you for joining us on this journey with the Estradas. We hope it inspires you to make a difference in your own community. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, because kindness is something we all can give.